The Super Nintendo Entertainment System, aka the SNES, aka the SNES, aka the Super Famicom, aka the Super Comboy, aka the home of some of the greatest video games of all time. Games like Super MarioWorld, Donkey Kong Country, and Super Metroid, games that defined a generation that went on to influence those we know and love today, that created entirely new genres. The SNES has gone down in history as one of the most important and influential game consoles of all time. However, it was also home to some real stinkers. As with all of our best/worst games videos, we need to lay down a few ground rules. First, the game must have been released on the SNES in at least one territory, bit of a no-brainer, and second, it must have received at least 7 professional reviews. As these games are over 30 years old, it can be a little difficult to find 7 reviews for the SNES version alone, so as long as the game was terrible on every platform it had the misfortune to grace, it counts. Let's look at some. I'm Ben from TripleJump, and here are the 10 worst games for the SNES. Number 10. Rival Turf, 48.25%. Rival Turf, or Rushing Beat if you want to get original Japanese about this, is a 2-player arcadey beat-em-up that didn't so much take inspiration from the wildly more successful Final Fight as copy it pixel for pixel. But like a child copying another kid's answers instead of paying attention in class, it failed to understand everything that made that game good. Playing as Jack Flack, no, not Jack Black, that would be too interesting, or Oswald Uzi Nelson, or both if you manage to trick a friend into playing, players are tasked with rescuing Jack's girlfriend and wiping the city clean of the evil Street Kings gang. At least that's if you're playing the localized versions. The original Japanese had a wildly different story following the far more normally named Rick Norton and Douglas Build as they rescue Norton's sister from a mysterious figure and shut down the production of an illegal stimulant polluting the city's streets. However, while this version of the story had higher production values, it even had an opening cutscene, the gameplay was just as dull. Desperately short on originality is, as one reviewer put it, the perfect way to sum up Rival Turf. Gameplay was bland, repetitive, and boring, collision detection and physics were almost non-existent, and the characters were carbon copies of their Final Fight counterparts. Best to stay off this particular lawn. Number 9. Wayne's World, 46.17%. Whoever decided basing a run-and-gun platformer on the brilliant stoner-esque comedy Wayne's World, and whoever seconded that idea, was clearly huffing something, but here we are. Unsurprisingly, the game is not good. It has its moments, but even over its remarkably short runtime, they do not last. Playing as the titular Wayne, or at least a strange bobble-headed caricature of the guy, the story involves both heroes being sucked into an arcade game where Garth is immediately captured by a gelatinous purple cube and Wayne must do whatever it takes to rescue him. Whatever it takes involves hopping around 4 rather monochromatic and samey levels and blasting away sentient objects with a super-powered guitar. The pixelized cutscenes were, frankly, nightmarish at times and were probably akin to what you might see if you decided to watch the film after downing a bucket of LSD, especially the Bohemian Rhapsody scene. The in-game graphics were just flat and lifeless, looking a decade out of date even in the 90s, and the gameplay was so uninspired you'd have been bored of it before you'd even picked up the controller. Critics naturally panned it, several calling it the worst game of 1993. Party on, or don't, as this party should definitely be shut down by the police. Number 8. Tecmo Secret of the Stars, 44.8%. Fans of turn-based RPGs were spoiled for choice on the SNES, with masterpieces like Earthbound and Chrono Trigger giving them hours upon hours of exciting gameplay, incredible stories, and beautiful pixel art worlds. Then, there was Secret of the Stars. The game was developer Tecmo's first and only foray into the world of JRPGs, and while they had some good ideas, it's abundantly clear this wasn't their field of expertise. Known as Aquatalion, maybe, in Japan, the game sees players take on the role of Rei, leader of the Aquatalion forces, as he builds up a band of plucky heroes to take on the might of the evil demon Homuncrews. Gameplay is your typical JRPG affair of wandering around a large open world, grinding random battles for XP, and trying to comprehend an overly complex story riddled with translation errors. But there's a twist. Not only do you control old Rei and his Aquatalions, but also a second group of ragtag warriors called the Custera. Well, this idea held plenty of promise, such as having separate stories or times where one team had to save the other. In reality, it meant laboriously grinding 2 parties, as XP wasn't shared. Critics slammed its poor graphics graphics, buggy, shallow gameplay, and old even for the time mechanics. Maybe just stick to Final Fantasy VI, huh? Number 7. Shaq-fu, 44.5%. While kung fu fighting probably isn't the first thing you'd think of when picturing a game starring a 7-foot-tall basketball player, you might be surprised to know it also wasn't developer Delphine Softwares. No, they wanted to make, you guessed it, a basketball game until Shaquille O'Neal came rolling in telling them how much he loved Mortal Kombat, and thus Shaq-fu was born. The game's setup is a simple one and positively insane. Shaq, while on his way to a charity basketball game in Tokyo, stops in at a dojo where he meets a martial arts master. This master then transports Shaq to an alternate dimension where he must beat people up to rescue a young boy from a mummy. Oscar-worthy material, if you ask me. Unfortunately, while the graphics and animations were great for the time, literally nothing else was. The story was nonsensical, the game was insultingly short, and the fighting, literally the only thing it needed to get right, was boring, lacking any sort of strategy. Naturally, it has appeared in many worst games of all time lists. For some reason, developers Big D's Productions thought it could be a good idea to release a follow-up/reboot called Shaq-Fu: A Legendary Born. It was not. It really was not. Number 6. Mario is Missing, 43.5%. What's this? A Mario game in a video about the worst SNES games? Impossible! But no, your eyes and ears do not deceive you, friend. If you star in over 200 games, you're going to have a few duds along the way, and this is one hell of a dud. Envisioned as an educational game, Mario is Missing sees Mario go missing! Controlling Luigi, it's up to the player to travel the world, gathering treasures and solving puzzles to rescue him. Gameplay is tediously simple, to the point that calling it gameplay is more than a little generous. In essence, all players can do is walk back and forth along some incredibly samey streets, reading pamphlets and asking the locals questions to find out facts about various real-world historical monuments and buildings and answer questions on them. There are enemies, but as they can't hurt Luigi, they're more of a nuisance than anything else, with the player having to squash them to recover lost treasures. As critics stated, there was no challenge to be found here. If you love history but haven't got the attention span to, say, read a book or a Wikipedia article, then by all means give this game a try. Otherwise, avoid it as you would one of Bowser's hammers. Number 5. Blazion the Bio-Cyborg Challenge, 42.25%. Side-scrolling space shoot-em-ups are very much a thing of the past, having been largely replaced with the far more anxiety-inducing and dexterity-challenging bullet hell shooter. While their decline can't be blamed on a single factor, games like Blazion the Bio-Cyborg Challenge certainly didn't help. As an arcade title, the game wasn't bad, setting players up with a quick story about the oppressive Imperial Earth Army and their battalions of terrifying bio-cyborgs before dropping them right into the action. The SNES version, with its limited memory, had to make a few changes. This included removing both the opening and ending cutscenes, robbing players of any story, removing co-op, simplifying levels, and cutting several enemy types, resulting in a much shallower gaming experience. It doesn't help that the gameplay itself is far too ponderously slow for an action-centric shoot-em-up. With juddery scrolling backgrounds, poor enemy AI, and a low enemy count, players barely have to think. Just hold down the trigger and watch the lackluster explosions. Oh, lovely. Critics agreed that while it had its fun ideas, like being able to capture and use enemies, it was overall little more than an unremarkable, mediocre, and bland shooter. Maybe just let those bio-cyborgs win. Anything would be more entertaining than this. Number 4. Race Driving, 42%. Another game that worked wonderfully well as an arcade title, this time due to its, quote, true force feedback steering wheel, ignition key, 4-speed shifter, and 3 foot pedals, an accelerator, a brake, and a clutch. The SNES version was missing a whole lot more than that G from the title. Like the arcade version, the SNES Race Driving gave players the option of racing in any of 4 different cars on a total of 3 different tracks. Not much by today's standards, but this was 1990. Both versions also try to put players inside the car by simulating a first-person view, complete with working dashboard and, for the time, accurate car physics, but as only one had the fun tactile peripherals, only one succeeded. Unfortunately, the SNES's limited memory was once more its Achilles heel. Graphics took a considerable hit on the port over, but so did sound, frame rate, and worst of all, handling. Trying to steer any of the available cars around even the slightest bend could see players spinning out like an F1 driver with a blown tire. As one reviewer put it, this version is an insult to the arcade game. It's like driving a coloured box that handles like a rock. We can relate. Number 3. Paladin's Quest, 41.83%. As previously mentioned, if you love your RPGs, you are spoilt for choice with the SNES, and that alone is reason enough to steer clear of Paladin's Quest. If, on the other hand, you are averse to originality, competent storytelling, and, well, fun, you've come to the right place. With another incomprehensible story filled with inscrutable and unpronounceable names, Paladin's Quest feels like the cheap pound shop version of every other RPG game that came before it. The plot revolves around a boy named Chesney who activates an ancient machine on a dare and unwittingly releases a being of pure evil, a being he is then tasked with destroying. Gameplay-wise, it can only be described as stale and trite. Taking all the best bits of Final Fantasy and Secret of Mana but capturing none of their heart or soul, the game just falls flat. To its credit, one interesting change up to the formula is the fact that characters don't have MP, instead drawing on their own health to cast spells. That one good idea didn't absolve Paladin's Quest of its sins, namely clunky controls, aggravating backtracking, and graphics that had been bettered a console generation prior. Paladin's Quest? More like, that's a paladin. Got 'em. Number 2. Space Invaders, 36.67%. You'd think it would be impossible to mess up a timeless, deceptively simple classic like Space Invaders, yet here we are. There have been dozens of versions of the all-star alien blasting arcade game over the years, each improving the graphics or tweaking the gameplay in new and exciting ways. Each, that is, save for the 1997 version for the SNES. Just like the original, which came out way back in 1978, likely making it older than anyone watching this video, let us know in the comments. Players are dropped straight into the action, putting them in a turret and telling them to blast away at the encroaching alien beasties. The only problem is that apart from the option to change the background, this version is exactly the same game as the arcade version which came out almost 2 decades prior. Compared to its contemporaries, it was just too slow and a little dull. 1997 was, after all, also the year of the PS1 and the N64, of GoldenEye 007 and Final Fantasy VII. Games, gamers, and the entire world had moved on to bigger and better things. Games were growing up, evolving, and many critics saw it as an insult to charge so much for a title that would only play for an hour before getting bored. Even 3 decades ago, publishers were swindling gamers in the name of nostalgia, it seems. Number 1. Home Alone 2 Lost in New York, 30.5%. Movie tie-in games have been around as long as there have been arcade machines and consoles powerful enough to even vaguely simulate the action from the silver screen. Unfortunately, it didn't take developers long to realize they could slap any old rubbish together, and as long as it had a recognized brand on the cover, it would sell like hotcakes, and thus, the terrible movie tie-in was born. Incredibly loosely based on the film, Home Alone 2 sees players controlling the little menace Kevin McAllister as he slides 2/3 of a triple jumps and shoots his way across New York like a mini Rambo. Enemies are an eclectic mix of grown-ups just trying to go about their day and sentient mops and luggage, but none provide anything close to a challenge. The sound effects are enough to make you want to jam ice picks in your ears. The gameplay is nonsensical, dull, and mind-numbingly repetitive, and the whole thing is unforgivably short for a full-priced game. Critics bashed the game's lack of originality, frustratingly imprecise controls coupled with the need for some very precise jumps, and overall sloppiness. One went so far as to say, "I can only recommend that you avoid and/or set this game aflame." With a reception like that, it's surprising it wasn't buried out in the desert with E.T.